Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of the podcast, The Written Page. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I'm coming to you over the YouTube channel Anton GF, and I'm talking to you from Jackson in Tennessee in the United States of America. This is a new episode, as I said, of The Written Page, and it's one that I've been wanting to do for a long, long time, ever since I read this book that I have in my hand right now, and a couple others that we might be talking about as well. But specifically this book called Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison, The Making of a Masterpiece. And of course, that album is a masterpiece, and this book really does it justice. The author is Michael Streissguth, and he is joining us via the phone from Syracuse in the state of New York. He has edited Ring of Fire, the Johnny Cash Reader. He is the author of biographies about the great Jim Reeves and Eddy Arnold, as well as many other interesting works. And he's also an associate professor in the English department of LeMoyne College in Syracuse, New York. And we will welcome him right now here to The Written Page. Michael, welcome to The Written Page, and thank you for answering our call.
Thank you, Anton. It's great to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you. I've been wanting to do this, as I was telling you before we began recording, for a long, long time. And specifically, since I read 3 books that you wrote that I think are outstanding, and I recommend to everybody out there. The one about Jim Reeves, the one about Eddy Arnold, 2 great country music stars of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and beyond. And then this book that we're going to be talking about a little bit more closely. Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison, The Making of a Masterpiece. Now, you've written a lot, Michael, about music, especially country music. What are, if any, your first musical memories, particularly in the field of country music?
Well, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, and Washington, D.C. Used to really be a capital, a hotbed of bluegrass music. Mm-hmm. And it was a great place also to be exposed to the other roots music in America. And it's mind-boggling to some, but I can remember growing up in Washington, and bluegrass music was on FM radio during the drive time hours. And so there was never any shortage of good music in the Washington area, live music. And some of my first memories of country music were listening to some of those stations around D.C. And Baltimore, D.C. were a destination for many Southerners during the wartime and the post-war time who came up from North Carolina and West Virginia and southwestern Virginia for jobs. And of course they brought their music and their love of the music, and for that reason the DC area, the Baltimore DC area, was definitely rich in country music and bluegrass music. So there really was never a time that I can remember when there wasn't country music around. My mother had a Johnny Cash album. She had an Eddy Arnold album, and there was always some love of country music. My father liked Western swing music, and so it was always around and always an influence.
I assume we're talking about the years of the folk revival here in the United States, and when folk music began to sell again after many years and became really popular. It got on, as you said, FM radio. What were the artists that you were drawn to in those days?
Well, I mean, what artists weren't I drawn to? I mean, certainly Willie Nelson and Merle Haggard and Johnny Cash, and Johnny Cash opened doors to other musicians to me, like Johnny Horton, for example. And so some of the real stars in country music, and now also. Because I lived in D.C. and because there was a lot of great blues music on the radio, there was American University, its radio station WAMU, had a great roots programs, and WDCU, which was affiliated with the University of the District of Columbia, had a wonderful blues program. And so I was listening to Muddy Waters and Wynonie Harris and Louis Jordan, Coco Taylor. So it was just a big blend of music, and I've never really gotten away from my love of many genres, hot jazz and the blues and country and bluegrass. It just so happens I've done more writing about country music than anything else. But no, I loved all that, all those stars of country music, Charlie Pride and Charlie Rich, and into later years, people like Keith Whitley and Ricky Skaggs, who became big in the 1980s.
And I could sense from reading your books that you and I have a lot in common, and I can see that as you are parading all those names of those great country music stars. And you also mention other genres that are close to my heart as well, like blues music and jazz and all of those you mentioned. When you mentioned WAMU, the name of Eddie Stubbs always comes to mind, who, if I'm not mistaken, had a show on that station and then became a very important announcer on the Grand Ole Opry, WSM, when I was living in Nashville myself several years ago.
Well, and he really he was in the Johnson Mountain Boys, which was a local Maryland-based bluegrass band, and I can still remember hearing his first radio show on WAMU, and he was so nervous, and it came across, and he certainly left those nervous years behind. He's become such a polished disc jockey and master of ceremonies. So the great Eddie Stubbs, certainly remember him well.
Also a very nice person. I got a chance to meet him several times on the Grand Ole Opry, and he was always gracious. He would talk to everybody, and wow, the pool of knowledge that that man has about the history of country music is amazing. And of course, they call him the walking encyclopedia of country music. Now, you have edited the Johnny Cash Reader, like I said. You've written a biography of Johnny Cash, but we're talking about this book here that I have in my hand, Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison, The Making of a Masterpiece. This book in particular, to me, is fascinating, and I would like to know, how did the project of writing this book about Folsom Prison come about?
And that's a good question. I had edited this Johnny Cash Reader that you mentioned, which is a compendium of works by other writers. I had been working on a biography of Cash, and I was coming across so many great articles and essays that were long out of print, and I thought these need to come back and be reintroduced to an audience, and so that book was done. And my publisher, the Capo Press, had just put out a book on Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks album, and I thought to myself, if I were going to write a book about an album in country music, what would it be? And the answer was very quick in coming. There was really, to me, no other choice than Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash's At Folsom Prison album. So that was the genesis.
So what about this Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison album is so captivating to you? I know why it is captivating to me, but somebody that has delved so deeply into this album to write a book as good as this one, what attracted you specifically about that wonderful album by Johnny Cash from 1968?
Well, I think it was different, right? It was a big album in the late '60s, but it was unlike many of the psychedelic albums, the kind of experimental rock albums, the folk albums, the folk rock. To me, it was really a quintessential 1960s statement in that it reaches out and says something about the disenfranchised, I think, and forces us to tried to understand the plight of prisoners, and I think that's what Cash was in part trying to accomplish. And so, to me, it was just a very rare statement that it did capture some of the mood of the 1960s. And then, I mean, if you think about it in the context of Cash's career, it really kind of brought him back. It was a comeback album for Cash, and I think when we talk about Johnny Cash's image today, a lot of what we think about in terms of that man in black image really came from Folsom and the marketing of Folsom. But at the same time, when we talk about the issues that were near and dear to Cash's heart, again, concern for people on the fringes of society that we associate with him. Again, there is no album that is clearer on that subject than Folsom. So it was rock, it was country, it was folk, it was just so much, and that's why I think I was drawn to it.
I've always found it very interesting how Johnny Cash had this connection with prison life and the life of people behind prison walls. He actually cut several albums at different prisons, not just this one, but the one at San Quentin and the one that's called something like Behind Prison Bars, and then even one at Österåker prison in Sweden. What do you think, since you've done some research about this album in particular, what do you think that attracted Johnny Cash about prison life to make him decide to put on such shows? Because it wasn't just once or twice throughout his career. He sort of peppered his live appearances with appearances at prisons. And that is surprising because not many artists of the caliber of Johnny Cash do things like that.
Well, I think, one, he understood that the audiences in the prisons just really responded well to him. And a lot of them thought that he had done time himself when they heard the line, "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die," in Folsom Prison Blues, that he himself had done hard time. And I think Cash's goal was to put it on record. I think he knew that it would make for just a fabulous album, and he wanted for many years to do this album at Folsom Prison. And it was, again, it was in part to say something in solidarity with prisoners, but it was also because he knew it was going to sell if it ever happened, and of course it did. And I think, like any popular item, anything that's sold on the market, sometimes you kind of go back and you do it again and again and again to see if it works again. And of course, a year later, he went into San Quentin, and it was all the more popular. And so I think a little of it was kind of going back to the well, knowing that people would always be interested in anything that was associated with cash and prisons.
You mentioned that the album sold really well, and it did. It really did. Against all odds, really, Johnny Cash knew that such an album would sell. But reading your book, one gets the impression that the powers that be at Columbia Records did not agree with him. Why would that be?
Well, I think that in some very kind of typical thinking of the time at the corporate level, there was some concern about the image of Cash and the image of the label, recording an album for rapists and murderers and the like just wouldn't look good. And I think even the people, even the members of the band who I spoke with, who were still alive, Marshall Grant and Fluke Holland, even they said that they did not expect the popular reaction that it got. At that time, it was very difficult to get Cash into the studio because his mind really wasn't on his music. He He was wrestling with a major drug problem. He was trying to get out of his marriage to his first wife, and this really was a way to get a new Johnny Cash album. And so the expectations across the board were rather low, and you really just have to chalk it up to Cash's vision. I mean, Cash had a vision of how good this could be, and that there's no question that vision was realized.
You're listening to a new episode of The Written Page. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, coming to you from Jackson in Tennessee in the United States of America. And today we have Michael Streissguth, who's up in Syracuse, New York, and we're talking about his book, Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison, The Making of a Masterpiece. Now, the book, Michael, is thoroughly researched. It's extremely informative, really well written. It's in many ways a page-turner because, you know, I read this book the first time I read it, and I've read it more than once, but I read it really quickly, and at the end of it, I felt kind of sad that it was over. It's not a very long book, but it has a lot of information, some really good illustrations, many of which appear in this book for the first time. But as I said, it is thoroughly researched. How did you carry out that research? How did you go about doing this? And what difficulties, if any, did you come across along the way?
Well, I'm a trained journalist. That's what I studied in school, and I worked for a time as a journalist. And a journalist just has to go to the source, and there's no way of getting around that. You just can't write a convincing book about a prison in California from behind from behind your desk, right? You have to get out. And so I went to Folsom Prison. I tried to get a feel of what it was like to be there. I got in touch with former prison guards who were able to describe the scene, the environment at Folsom. And then what was probably the most challenging part of it was tracking down former inmates, people who had been at Folsom when Cash was there in 1968 when he recorded the concert. And the California Department of Corrections will not tell you who was in a state prison at a particular time. They're wanting to, for safety reasons mostly, to protect the privacy of the inmates. So I went to the state archives in Sacramento, California, and started looking through some of the Department of Corrections records. And what I did find is that there are records available that will tell you when will identify prisoners and when they were paroled from Folsom. And, of course, a little bit of extrapolation, you can figure out if they were paroled, say, in late 1968, there's a good chance that they were in prison in January of 68 when Cash was there. So I got the names, and I just started locating phone numbers, and I finally located 5 or 6 prisoners who'd been in the audience. And that, to me, was golden, because we talk about what a great thing that Cash did for the prisoners. Everybody talks about that, and even Cash himself. But I had never read a prisoner's testimony at Folsom, a former Folsom prisoner's testimony about what Cash had brought in. So it was just so valuable to talk to former inmates about that. And there was one inmate in particular, former inmate by the name of Millard Deadman, who spoke. He was a jazz fan. An African-American man who'd grown up in a very tough circumstances in South Central Los Angeles, and he might have been forgiven for staying away from Johnny Cash's concert, for staying back in his cell, but he didn't, and he went to the show and he talked about just the experience and how Cash made him feel like somebody on the outside cared about him, and that moment he forgot about being in prison, and it was like he was on the outside and going to hear a concert along with everybody else who was free to go to a concert. So that was to me, very powerful and very important, and kind of was central to the work I did. Now, meanwhile, on the other coast, back in New York, Sony Records, who owns the Johnny Cash catalog, was kind enough to allow me to go into a studio with an engineer and listen to the raw tape of the concert. And that's when I discovered that there were actually two concerts at Folsom Prison on that day in 1968. And so I listened to the raw tape of both concerts. And many people who know the album will know that moment when Cash sings Folsom Prison Blues, when he says, "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die," and the audience just goes nuts. And you think, who are these desperate characters that Cash is performing for, who would cheer the mention of such a cold-blooded murder? And as we were listening, the engineer and I were listening to the raw tape. I noticed that there was just silence when Cash uttered that line, and I thought to myself, wait a second. I mean, that's so essential to that particular performance of the song that I noticed immediately when there was silence. So I thought, well, gee, what happened there? And I asked the engineer to rewind the tape, and we listened again, and sure enough, we watched the tape go by on the reel, and it was just dead silence. And so the engineer then got out the album edit, the tape that was the final edit for the album release. It was the master for the album release. And sure enough, we're listening to Folsom Prison Blues, and we hear Johnny Cash say, "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die." And then we see a piece of Scotch tape, and we hear the prisoners roar, and then we see another piece of Scotch tape. That moment had been edited in, and it was just mind-boggling to me. Now, I mean, of course, it's not surprising that the album was edited, the concert was edited in some way, shape, or form, but something seemed very surprising to understand that line had been edited in. So that was another, I think, important part. Sony was great about cooperating with me, and to me, it was essential to listen to the raw tape when writing a book about that concert.
That's a very interesting story to actually realize that that tape had been doctored at that point. Fortunately, both concerts have been issued on a 2 CD set that includes not only the performances of Johnny Cash, but also those of the Stadler brothers and Carl Perkins, who were also part of the Johnny Cash troupe at the time. June Carter appears as well, of course. It's just a fantastic album that I have treasured for years, and when it finally came out on those two concerts, I was so happy to be able to hear the entire performance of Johnny Cash. What you mentioned about the tape being doctored in some moments, that wasn't necessary. I remember when Johnny Cash sings Mary John Wilkins' The Long Black Veil, which had been recorded by Lefty Frizzell before Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash has to stop, and he chuckles and he says, "And I hear somebody applaud," because he's talking in the song about the fact that he had been in the arms of his best friend's wife, and so he does not, give it away. And so some of the inmates were happy about that reaction. So in some cases, that would not have been necessary, but it's such an iconic performance of Folsom Prison Blues that it's really interesting to hear that it didn't actually happen the way we hear it on the original album. You mentioned before, Michael, that it wasn't just one concert, and in fact what appeared on the original album in 1968 was heavily edited because it's not really an incredibly long album, but the performance, actually the original performance on January 13th, 1968, included two concerts that were recorded, apparently because Johnny Cash wanted to make sure that there would be enough material for the album and enough usable material. But apparently, the first concert pretty much was good enough, and most of what we hear on the original album comes from that first concert. Very briefly, because Michael, I want, of course, the listeners to get this book and read the book, and they can find out a lot more information on that book about this stuff. But very briefly, how did these two recorded concerts at Folsom Prison on January 13th, 1968 come about? How did this happen?
Well, it happened again after Cash's effort to secure the permission from Columbia Records to do it, and then what's important to know about Columbia Records, at least in its country music division at the time, is that there was a new man in town, if you will. There was a new sheriff in town, a new director of operations in Nashville, and his name was Bob Johnston. And many of your listeners probably will know about Bob Johnston's association with Bob Dylan.
That's right.
And the work that he had done with Dylan, and I think what happens is that Johnston was willing to take chances, and Johnston claims responsibility for bringing Bob Dylan to Nashville to record albums, and he takes credit for having paved the way for Cash to go to Folsom. So that's very important, that finally somebody at the label was championing this. And after that, it just became a matter of logistics. Cash had already done a concert at Folsom. It was just a year or so before. So everything was, all the people, all the logistics were kind of in place, and it happened quite easily. And it had been a minister who Cash knew by the name of Floyd Gresset. Knew him from Central California, and Gresset also ministered to inmates at Folsom. And it was Gresset who really helped kind of pave the way for that first show at Folsom, and then he kind of did the same for that second recorded concert at Folsom. And so the whole troupe, and again, you mentioned it, it's Carl Perkins, and it's the Tennessee Three, and it's the Statler Brothers, and it's June Carter. Interestingly enough, the rest of the Carter family did not come, June's mother and her two sisters, and because evidently of concerns about safety, but of course they had been there the previous year, and there had been no problem. So there's probably more to that story that I just don't know about. But they rehearsed the night before in Sacramento at a motel banquet room in Sacramento, California, not very far from Folsom. And that's where they put together the song Greystone Chapel. And Greystone Chapel was written by Glenn Shirley, who was an inmate there at Folsom, who had gotten a tape of his song Greystone Chapel to Floyd Gresset, who then handed it to Cash and asked him if he'd consider performing it at the show, or performing it or recording it at any time. And again, Cash had a sense of the dramatic. He had a sense of the show, and he knew that performing a song that had been written by an inmate, which wasn't a bad song at all, was going to attract attention. It was going to endear the audience to him. It was going to make for good copy once the album was promoted. So he rehearsed the song and brought it to Folsom, and it's opened by a nice little Carl Perkins lick there, and it really became one of the memorable songs from the album. So it was rehearsed there on January 12th, 1968. Cash rarely rehearsed with his band, and then they drove up to the old grim Maiden on the hill there, Folsom Prison, and did this album.
Johnny Cash chose to include that song Greystone Chapel by Glenn Shirley, which, as you said, is not a bad song at all. In fact, it's a very moving song because of the context in which it was recorded, because of who wrote it, and because of some of the words in there. And this is something that he did pretty much at the very last minute, like you mentioned. And at San Quentin, he did something similar with Shel Silverstein's A Boy Named Sue, which became a huge hit. Glenn Shirley apparently wasn't aware that Johnny Cash was going to be performing this song of his. And actually on the 2 CD set, we have several different versions, some of which had been previously unreleased, of Greystone Chapel. The Glenn Shirley story is pretty interesting, and I'm very happy that you go into it in the book, because I happen to have an album that he made when he came out of prison, or maybe right before he came out of prison, called Life at Vacaville Prison, that the fine folks at Bear Family over in Germany put out. And it's sort of the same idea, in this case an inmate playing 4 inmates. But Glenn Shirley actually joined Johnny Cash's troupe after he was released from prison. He got some help from Johnny Cash, but unfortunately, Michael, his story had a pretty tragic ending. What happened to this man, Glenn Shirley? Why couldn't he get acclimated to the life on the road with somebody as popular as Johnny Cash?
Well, as you point out, I mean, he did go to work for Johnny Cash in his publishing companies, and he toured with Cash and appeared on his shows. And I think it's really mind-boggling when you think about it, to go from behind bars to working for one of the best-known men in the world at that time. And I think that would be a lot to ask anybody to cope with. And I think that in combination with the fact that just in general, Shirley couldn't necessarily cope with life on the outside. I mean, if you're at Folsom Prison in 1968, you've either done something really bad, or you've committed many crimes that maybe in and of themselves weren't that bad, but you had accumulated quite a record. And Shirley was what some people might call a 3-time loser. I mean, he had robbed too many banks, too many convenience stores, and had found himself at Folsom. And so he'd been there for a while, and he'd actually gone into the juvenile detention program, going back to the 1950s in California. And so he was what they call institutionalized, and I think it was a little bit difficult. And as many people said, whom I've interviewed, is that he was a big deal on the inside. He had status on the inside, but in Johnny Cash's world, he was just maybe another employee, and no doubt an employee with a special story, but that may have been difficult for him to cope with as well. And he got back into drug use. He had been an abuser of drugs for some time, and that of course didn't help. And finally, after kind of exhibiting potential for violence, he was let go from the Johnny Cash world, and kind of drifted for a number of years. And finally, in the late 1970s, he committed suicide back out in California, at the home of a brother of his. So a tragic story, and also a story that I think in a way challenged the hope and the aspirations that Cash had for prisoners. I mean, one of Cash's messages was that if we just cared, if we just took an interest in people who had been incarcerated, that could lead to their rehabilitation. And of course, Cash embodied that. He did that. He got several men out of prison, and the tragic ending that Shirley met, in a way, contradicts that message of Cash's.
More details about the Glenn Shirley story in this book, Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison, The Making of a Masterpiece. written a few years ago by our guest on the written page today, Michael Streissguth. And of course, if you want to listen to Glenn Shirley sing, there's an album out there, Life at Vacaville Prison, out in California, and you can actually hear some of his songs. He even got around to writing songs that Eddy Arnold recorded in the 70s. I think one was called Portrait of My Woman. So he did have talent, not just as a singer, but also as a songwriter. Michael, you mentioned that you, as part of the research for your book, you got to visit Folsom Prison. What was it like visiting Folsom Prison all these years later after this great concert by Johnny Cash took place there?
Well, I mean, it was it for me was just an eye-opening experience, as you might imagine. I mean, the regimented lives that prisoners live, breakfast, going to work, recreation in the yard, lunch, dinner, lights out at 9 p.m. I mean, to kind of witness that routine, which I suppose is necessary, is again, it's rather startling, and also the lack of privacy that is there. Prisoners shower out in the cell block. There are no private shower stalls. The bars of their cell doors, that it's top to bottom bars. I mean, you look right in. There's nothing that is private, and so there's so much that the prisoners lose when they're paying their debt to society, as it were. And I think that to me was what was just again most fascinating. And then, of course, somehow I was expecting the ghosts of Johnny Cash to be there, and I really didn't experience that in the prison. I was more just kind of drawn by that present-day experience that inmates were having. But, however, there is a prison museum that anybody can go to if they choose to visit Folsom Prison. And there, a number of retired prison guards have these wonderful displays of old handmade weapons and portraits of famous prisoners who were there, and then of course there is a little bit of the history of Cash's prison shows there as well. So that's where I found Johnny Cash, and that the museum when I went in was crowded with maybe it's a small museum crowded with maybe 10 or 12 other visitors, and they were all there because of Johnny Cash, and they weren't prison historians. They were Johnny Cash fans who were in the area and wanted to somehow experience just a little piece of that show from 1968.
Along with San Quentin in the 40s and 50s and 60s and beyond, Folsom Prison had the reputation of being one of the toughest in the area. Do you get the feeling from having visited it that it still has that reputation?
Well, when Cash was there, it was a maximum security prison. There is another Folsom facility. It's a newer building, and that is the maximum security area. The prison that Cash was in is no longer maximum security. It's not a white collar prison either, but somehow the rules, the level of security is not as high, and so I think probably what I experienced was much different than what Cash experienced when he went in 1968. So yeah, I mean there were so many stories. Jim Marshall, the late photographer who was there with Cash that day, and he talked about going into the prison, and he had gotten off of a charge of assault with a deadly weapon. He he had shot and injured somebody with a gun, and he thought to himself how he could have been there at that moment. And he recalls walking in and the gates closing behind him, and he said to Johnny that, gee, that has an air of permanence to it. And you know, there was perhaps more of a desperate feeling in 1968 than what I experienced at Folsom when I went there.
You know, I told you before we began recording that I grew up in Europe. I spent my first 20 years of my life or so in the northwest of Spain, and it was there that I first listened to this album along with the San Quentin one, with which my father had on vinyl in his really huge record collection that he has still to this day in his house. And there was something about this album, Michael, Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison, that even though I was still learning English back then, and I didn't really completely understand everything Johnny Cash was saying, or everything that Johnny Cash was singing about, there was a little something there, or a huge something, I would say, there, that can't really be put into words. There was a certain emotion, there was a certain connection between Johnny Cash and the prisoners. There was a certain connection between what Johnny Cash was singing about and what these prisoners had lived through in their own lives. We have songs like "Dark as a Dungeon" by the great Merle Travis. We have "I Still Miss Someone" that would become a pretty big hit for Johnny Cash. Songs like "Cocaine Blues," one that always makes me cry, "Give My Love to Rose," which Johnny Cash had recorded originally in the 1950s, and then he did again here. Some funny songs as well, in a way. If anything, dealing with prison life could be funny, like 25 Minutes to Go, or Flush from the Bathroom of Your Heart. Anyway, what I'm trying to get at is Johnny Cash seems to have chosen his repertoire very carefully for this album, featuring songs with which the inmates could identify. Do you feel the same way as I do when you listen to this album about that little something that can be put into words very easily that actually happened that day in January of 1968 at that prison with Johnny Cash and his audience?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways they were in communion with each other, and these are inmates who wanted to love Johnny Cash. I mean, they walked in, many of them poised to love Johnny Cash. Again, they were with a person that they already knew was interested in them, and if not believing that he had actually done time. And I think part of that, Cash understood that, and he just sort of opened himself to these men. He loved them back, and part of this is Cash the showman. I mean, he had, as you point out, he had selected a concert list that emphasized their experience. I think led them to reflect on their experience, and then in turn helped them understand that Cash was sensitive to their experience. I mean, just because he was talking about in some of the songs love and coal mines and things of that nature, well, sometimes a coal mine, sometimes love is a prison of its own, and so Cash was very intentional about what he was doing. So there was a little bit of calculation, and then there was a little bit of love, and I think we have to talk about both of them. And of course, you've mentioned the box set that came out, which includes both the concerts from beginning to end, entirety, very raw. But they also knew; those inmates also knew that Cash was recording the concert for an album. And they were told to be rowdy, to be raucous, and they responded in kind. So again, there's that little bit of calculation in addition to that very, very much authentic love that was just a great recipe for a hit album.
They were told to be raucous and at the same time to stay away from certain words which would have to be edited out. Well,
that's true.
Because, you know, I think at some point during the album he says this is being recorded so you can't say certain words or something like that, you know, that actually are beeped out. I'm not. Sometimes I kind of put together both albums, the San Quentin one and the Folsom Prison one, because, you know, they are really companion volumes in my opinion. However, I always have the feeling that the Folsom Prison album is a much more effective one as far as the song choices. I know that A Boy Named Sue became a huge hit. San Quentin is a great song, but I think as a package, as an album to play from beginning to end, this Folsom Prison album really is a milestone. And from my own perspective, it stands among the greatest albums recorded, not just in country music, but in any genre of music in the 20th century. Would you agree with that?
I would agree. I would totally agree with that.
Now, Johnny Cash first became popular in the field of country music at a time when rock and roll was really changing the face of popular music. You know, Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, and all the rockabillys and the rock and rollers from the 1950s, all those pioneers of rock and roll that brought rock and roll not just to national fame but to worldwide exposure. But Johnny Cash somehow decided to stay true to his country roots as much as he was possible. Of course, he recorded some songs that catered to the rock and roll audience, of course, but he did stay really true to his country roots. You have written a lot about Johnny Cash, the Reader, the biography, this book about the Folsom Prison album. How can you explain, if you can, the iconic stature that Johnny Cash has attained throughout his career? Because in many cases, to many people, even people that casually know country music, Johnny Cash is, to this day, several years after his passing, synonymous with the word country music.
Well, I think it's for some of the reasons that you just enumerated. Cash has an appeal to such a broad audience, and there's a Johnny Cash almost for everybody. There's a Johnny Cash for the folk and western buffs. There's a Johnny Cash for the hardcore country fan. There's a Johnny Cash for the rock fan. There's a Johnny Cash for the gospel music fan and people who are interested in faith in general. I mean, let's face it. I mean, Cash wrote a novel about the life of the Apostle Paul. I mean, he was everywhere,
mm-hmm.
and I think for that reason, he's been able to just inspire people to think about him and think about his work. So the young, the old, I just think it's just a wide net that he cast, and I think in some ways he tapped into many of the myths of America and the myths of the West, the myths of the rock and roll lifestyle, the myths of the redeemed, and I think it's just. I mean, I have. It's just so universal. I have two students who went with me to the Johnny Cash Festival in Dyess, Arkansas, back in October, and they presented papers on the song. One did a paper on the song "Drive On" that Cash recorded on his first American album, and the other did a paper on "I Got Stripes," one of his big hits from the 1960s. And those students were talking about Cash as if he were still alive today. I mean, he's so real to them, and so real to many others. And I think his legacy is burning bright. And I tend to think that he may in some ways be talked about hundreds of years from now, much as many of the great poets and authors are. Cash's work, Cash's body of work, his image are that strong to kind of reinforce a long and lasting legacy.
And in so many ways, a lot of his songs, Michael, are still so relevant today, or as relevant today as when they were first written and recorded. You know, songs like Drive On, that, as you mentioned, talk about the Vietnam War. You know, we haven't really come that far. We still need songs like that. Those songs still are relevant these days. And you talked about many myths before. You just mentioned several myths regarding Johnny Cash. I would add that there's this myth that I have perceived over the years of country music seen as a very conservative kind of music. And I think there is some of that. But I think people who describe country music that way, they forget the long history that country music has from many decades ago, and how back in the 1920s there were really no differences between a country singer like Jimmy Rogers and a jazz musician and singer like Louis Armstrong, who recorded together, and his music was as bluesy as the music of African-American bluesmen in those days. And when you listen to the music of Johnny Cash, you realize that he was a really forward-thinking musician in many ways, not just politically, not just socially, but also in the way that he presented his music, because his music was very simple in general. The sound of it sounds pretty simple to most untrained ears. It's not that simple, really, but the way the music was presented, Michael, I think the way that he recorded some fantastic concept albums, that was really forward thinking for the time. There were not a lot of musicians within country music doing that kind of thing. When we think of concept albums, we usually think of the rock and pop field, you know, the Beatles, and then in the 1970s, all those progressive rock groups. But really, concept albums go way back to Frank Sinatra and, you know, the 1940s and 1950s. And within country music, Johnny Horton was recording concept albums in the 50s, and Johnny Cash recorded a string of fantastic concept albums. Would you consider Folsom Prison also one of Johnny Cash's concept albums?
Oh, no question about it. I mean, the concept was prison. I mean, and to me, the '60s was very much kind of a high watermark for the concept album, if you will. And Cash to me is right up there with the most important concept albums of the '60s. I mean, I think we should be mentioning. I'm very pleased that I think we are, in some ways, the culture is mentioning Folsom Prison in the same breath with Sgt. Pepper's, Surrealistic Pillow, Blonde on Blonde. I mean, this is one of the royal albums of the 1960s.
Absolutely, and I really think you're right when you talk about the long-lasting presence of Johnny Cash, because he transcends, I think, musical genres, and I think that is really important, because you cannot talk about Johnny Cash simply as a country artist, as you said before. And I think in many ways that's going to ensure that his music lives on. For some people, because of the music itself. For some people, because of the texts. Because in a day and age when Bob Dylan is awarded the Nobel Prize, I would think that we need to look at Johnny Cash and his lyrics as poems set to music in many cases.
Well, I think you're right, and I think that to me, one of his greatest legacies is that he told the story of a nation. And he told the story of a nation growing up, and a nation stumbling sometimes, a nation failing sometimes. And I think that when I look to Johnny Cash and when I think about Johnny Cash, that's what's on my mind. I mean, he's sung of the West, and he's sung of the prison experience. It amazes me when I hear the song "Drive On," which we've mentioned here, that he could have captured the Vietnam soldiers' experience so well, and then, of course, then the veterans' experience so well, when he himself never served, of course, in Vietnam. But he had that gift of of storytelling, and I think it was a gift, and I think ultimately that's his greatest gift to us.
And as a matter of fact, Michael, that song that you mentioned, "Drive On," I think it's even all the more effective on that concert at VH1 Storytellers with Willie Nelson. That is also a fantastic rendition of that particular song, "Drive On," that you mentioned and that one of your students at LeMoyne College has written about. You're listening to the voice of Michael Streissguth, joining us by phone from Syracuse, New York, where he is an associate professor in the English department of LeMoyne College, and he has written this book that I have in my hand, among several others, Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison, The Making of a Masterpiece. And you were telling me before we started recording, Michael, that this book is going to be reissued.
That's right. Later next year, I don't have the exact date, but later this year, 2019, the University Press of Mississippi will be bringing the book back into print, and it's revised, it's updated. There are new stories, new sections of the book. So looking forward to that release, certainly.
I'm looking forward to that as well. I'll buy it again and I'll read it again for, I wouldn't say the millionth time, but I've come back to this book many times, and I always find something new in there. And when I need to talk about Johnny Cash for whatever reason, or whenever I'm listening to this album, I bring the book out because it really is a great companion. As we're winding down the conversation, I know you have other things to do, and we've been talking for almost an hour now about Johnny Cash, believe it or not. There are other books that you've written, in particular two of them, Michael, that I would like to touch upon briefly, because those were actually the first books that you've written that I actually read back when I was living in Nashville and working on my PhD in Spanish at Vanderbilt University over there. I haven't come too far, really, since then in all these years, because now I'm living about 2 hours away from Nashville, still in the great state of Tennessee, the greenest state in the land of the free, as the Fess Parker song says. But one of these books is a biography of Jim Reeves. And gentleman Jim Reeves, Michael, was the very first singer of country music, also pop in many cases, because he crossed over pretty easily in the 1950s and early 60s before his tragic and untimely death. But he was one of the first, I think the very first singer of country music that I ever heard. And I remember the song was not "He'll Have to Go," which is a fantastic tune, but it was a version of the old Scotty Wiseman song, "Have I Told You Lately That I Love You." This book that you wrote, Like a Moth to a Flame, is also a painstakingly researched biography of Jim Reeves. What is it about Jim Reeves that attracted you to write this book?
It had a lot to do with having written a book about Eddy Arnold. And as I was writing about Eddy Arnold, I was able to learn about his role in really popularizing the smooth camp in country music, the smooth part of country music, that uptown countrypolitan sound. And I realized, though, that it was Jim Reeves who perfected that sound. And so I became quite interested in Reeves after writing the book about Eddy Arnold. And for that reason, researched a book on him, and it's amazing his international appeal. I mean, so many people who are natives of other countries, like yourself, talk about hearing Jim Reeves, and I just have to attribute that to the quality, the timbre of his voice that was just so appealing. Whether people understood the lyrics or not, it was kind of universal, and so that they're definitely in some ways they're companion books because in many ways they were companions in popularizing the Nashville sound.
And the Nashville sound was extremely important during the onslaught of rock and roll, when rock and roll really affected the popularity of country music nationwide. And so this Nashville sound, so to speak, or the countrypolitan sound that you mentioned, was an important answer from the Nashville industry to the rock and rollers that were sweeping the nation around 1956, 1957. And I think, as you mentioned, Jim Reeves was instrumental in that, as was Eddy Arnold, whose career began a lot earlier. One thing that I will share with you about Jim Reeves, Michael, is that when I was growing up and I was learning English in school, and I was always really interested in languages, not just English, but other languages, but particularly English, I would listen to the records of Jim Reeves that I had, the CDs or the vinyl records that I had by Jim Reeves, and would sit down and try to write down the lyrics to the songs. And that to me was something that really helped me learn English, learn to speak English, increase my vocabulary. Of course, I look at him now, I still have some of them, and I'm like, that's not really what he's singing. You know, I got a word wrong here or there. This is not exactly what he's singing. But listening to Bing Crosby, to Frank Sinatra, to Jim Reeves, to people whose singing was so clear, whose diction was so pristine, really personally helped me a great deal when it came to learning the language. I suspect, it's been the same for other people that live in other parts of the world. But in the case of Jim Reeves, he even got around to making records in Afrikaans for the South African people.
That's the truth, and so did Eddy Arnold, interestingly enough. And I think that you have to ask a very hard question with regard to Eddy Arnold's career, and that is, if Reeves hadn't died when he did, tragically, as you say, in the mid-1960s, would Eddy Arnold have had the career that he had in the 1960s? Mm-hmm. Eddy Arnold had established himself as a pioneer in the 1940s and would have been in the Country Music Hall of Fame either way. But at the same time, I think it was the void that Reeves left that opened the door for Arnold to have the second career that he had in the 1960s. And I think it's like Jim Reeves's albums, washed up on the shore of every country around the world. I mean, it's amazing. In many cases, I think he is bigger and better appreciated today, for example, in South Africa and in Great Britain as well, than he is here in the United States.
Particularly in Ireland, in the case of the British Isles, because he also recorded some songs that became extremely popular there, one of which was his own version of Danny Boy, which I've always felt like Elvis Presley, a really, sick Elvis Presley in the late 1970s, around 1976, when he recorded his own version of Danny Boy. I always feel like he had the Jim Reeves version in mind. But whatever the case, one interesting thing about Jim Reeves, the relationship that you're mentioning between Jim Reeves and Eddy Arnold, it's that for me personally, I first heard Jim Reeves and then I heard Eddy Arnold. And what attracted me about Eddy Arnold, particularly the records that he made, in the 50s and in the late 40s even, was how much his voice sounded like the voice of Jim Reeves, when really it's the other way around. But when I heard Eddy Arnold sing "Take Me in Your Arms and Hold Me," which I think is the first song I ever heard by him, which he recorded for RCA Records, just like Jim Reeves was an RCA recording artist, it struck me how much his voice sounded like Jim Reeves, even if the instrumentation, with the soft steel guitar and still no drums or anything like that, because there were no go on the Opry around that time. It still sounded very, very similar. So in many ways, I think you're right, and I think those two books that you've written read really well together. They're really good companion volumes, and I think they are absolutely essential for anybody that is interested in this change that happened in country music in the mid-1950s to the early 1960s, which we come to know as the Nashville Sound. Michael, it really has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I've been wanting to do this for a long, long time, as I said at the beginning, and it really has met my expectations. It's been wonderful chatting with you. All I would like to do before we finish is to give you a chance, because this is something I do on the show with every author that I get to interview and chat with. For anybody that has not seen or ever read your book, Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison, The Making of a Masterpiece, if they come across a copy of this book, especially when it is reissued sometime next year, what are they going to find in this book of yours?
Well, I think they're going to find a story of a man who had a vision, a story of a man who understood that his art could have an influence and wasn't working just to fill his bank account or to fulfill his ego. That he indeed used his art as a change agent, and I think that's something that I appreciate about Cash, and I hope readers will appreciate that as well.
Absolutely agree with that, and they're really wise words. For anybody out there that has never heard Johnny Cash, I can't imagine anyone that has never heard of or has never heard Johnny Cash. But would you think that Folsom Prison, Johnny Cash and Folsom Prison, would be the best album to introduce yourself in the music of Johnny Cash, or are there any others that you would recommend to listeners out there?
Oh boy, I would certainly point people to Folsom Prison, and in many ways, it's the quintessential Cash album. But you really can't go wrong starting anywhere with Johnny Cash. And I grew up I was a teenager in the 1980s, and I was hearing Johnny Cash's contemporary music on the air in the 1980s. And sometimes his contemporary music is dismissed, but even in his lowest moments, there was still something interesting. There was still something compelling about the stories, the song selection, the voice that could captivate a teenager like me. So I would recommend Folsom, but I would also urge anybody to throw a dart at the Johnny Cash dartboard and see what it comes up. There's always going to be something interesting.
I started with Sun Records and then got just about any album by Johnny Cash that I could get my hands on, the good, the not so good, because just like my dad always says about Bob Dylan, and he's a huge fan of Bob Dylan, even in Dylan's lesser known, not so good album, there's just a few songs, maybe 3, 4, 5 songs, that are still really memorable. And I think the same thing happens in the case of Johnny Cash. Even in albums that didn't make it as big, and I can think of several titles now that come to mind, there are certain songs that stay with you, even in those albums that are not as well known as you say. Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison, The Making of a Masterpiece, written by Michael Streissguth, who has been our guest for the last hour or so. Thank you so much, Michael. I can't tell you how thankful I am to you for answering our call today on The Written Page.
Thank you, Anton. It's been great to be with you.
This has been a new episode of The Written Page that you'll be able to hear on Anton GF, my YouTube channel. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I'm saying goodbye from Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. This has been The Written Page, and the copyright, as always, is mine, year 2019, and it's been recorded live in Jackson, Tennessee. Thank you very much for listening, and as old Fern Young always used to say on his radio show, so long, everybody.